Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The silence was the first betrayal. It seeped into the little room, thick and suffocating, swallowing the sound of her own heartbeat. Rain whispered against the window pane, a soft, sad rhythm for the end of the world. Her world, at least. Jaren stood before her, his hand intertwined with Isolde's. Her mate, her best friend. The two halves of her heart fused together into a weapon pointed directly at her chest. "Talia," Jaren started, his voice a smooth, practiced stone. No tremor, no regret, just finality. "We didn't want you to find out from someone else." Her gaze dropped to their joined hands. His knuckles were white. Isolde's fingers were threaded through his, a perfect, damning fit. The scent of them filled the air, Jaren's familiar pine and earth, now choked by the cloying sweetness of Isolde's honeysuckle perfume. A perfume Talia had helped her choose last spring. A gift. Stupid, a small voice whispered inside her. "You were so stupid." She felt the scar on her lip, a tiny raised line she'd had since childhood, begin to tingle. It always did when she was trying not to cry. "The moon has corrected its choice," Isolde said, her voice soft with a pity that felt like acid. "Our bond, Jaren's and mine, it's the true one, the fated one. We can feel it." The moon corrected its choice. The words didn't just hurt, they hollowed her out. They implied she had been a mistake, a placeholder, a cosmic error that was now, thankfully, being rectified. All the moments they had shared, the stolen kisses behind the elder tree, the promises whispered under starry skies, the comforting weight of his arm around her as they slept. All of it was a lie, a cosmic typo. Talia didn't scream. The sound was trapped somewhere deep in her lungs, a jagged thing with claws. She didn't cry. The tears were frozen behind her eyes. She simply looked at Jaren, searching for a flicker of the boy she'd loved since they were children. The boy who'd bandaged her scraped knees and swore to fight any wolf who ever made her sad. He wasn't there. In his place stood a man, an alpha born, with cold, resolute eyes. He was choosing his destiny, and his destiny wore her best friend's face. "You have to understand, Tal," Jaren said, and the old nickname was a fresh stab. "This is bigger than us. It's about the strength of the pack. An alpha needs a strong Luna." The implication hung in the air, sharp and ugly. "And you are not strong." She was an omega, quiet, overlooked, born to soothe, not to lead, born to love one person with her entire being. She had done that. She had given him everything, and he was giving it all to someone else. Her inner wolf, a gentle creature that had only ever known the warmth of his, let out a piteous whine. It was a sound no one else could hear, a phantom echo of a bond turning to poison. The golden thread that had connected their souls for years felt thin, frayed. A cold draft blew through, the place where it used to burn warm inside her chest. Talia finally found her breath. It was a shallow, shaky thing. "I see," she said, just 2 words. They felt like swallowing glass. The relief on their faces was instantaneous and obscene. They had expected hysterics, begging, a scene. Her quiet acceptance was a gift they didn't deserve. Isolde even managed a small, watery smile. "I knew you'd understand. You've always been so reasonable." The friendship bracelets they'd woven together when they were 10 years old felt impossibly tight on her wrist. She wanted to rip it off. She wanted to rip her own skin off. Instead, she turned. She didn't run. Her movements were deliberate, almost robotic. One foot in front of the other. She walked out of the sitting room, her back straight, feeling their combined gaze like a physical weight. She could hear them start to whisper behind her. their voices a low murmur of justification and relief. The sound faded as she climbed the stairs to the room she had shared with Jaren. His scent was a ghost on the pillows, in the air, woven into the very fabric of the life she had thought was hers. She moved with a strange, cold purpose. She pulled a worn leather satchel from beneath the bed. She didn't pack much, a spare tunic, a block of hard cheese, and a water skin from the pantry stores. The small, whittled wooden wolf her father had carved for her before he passed. It was the only thing in this whole house that felt entirely hers. She left behind the book of poetry Jaren had given her for her last birthday, its pages filled with his notes in the margins. She left the pressed night blossom Isolde had given her, meant to signify eternal friendship. Symbols, lies. She left it all to burn. With the satchel slung over her shoulder, she walked back down the stairs. They were still in the sitting room, now wrapped in each other's arms, a perfect picture of fated love. They didn't even look up as she walked past the doorway and out into the night. The rain was heavier now, a torrential, angry downpour that soaked her thin cloak in seconds. The wind whipped her hair across her face, cold and biting. The path leading away from the pack house was already turning to mud, trying to suck her back, to hold her in place. But she kept walking. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she would shatter. With every step she took, the frayed bond in her chest stretched thinner, tighter. The pain was a living thing, a cold fire licking at her ribs. She was walking away from her mate, from her home. Her wolf howled in protest, clawing at the inside of her soul, begging her to turn back. "He is ours," it cried. "Our home." "He is not ours anymore," she answered, her steps faltering but never stopping. She reached the edge of the packlands, where the ancient warding stones hummed with a low energy. For pack members, passing through was as easy as breathing. She took a step across the boundary line, and the bond snapped. The agony was absolute. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a feeling. It was a physical severing, a vital part of her ripped out by the roots. A scream finally tore from her throat, stolen by the wind and the rain. Her knees buckled. She fell into the mud, clutching her chest as her world dissolved into a universe of pure, white-hot pain. It was the death of a soul, her soul. She lay there for a long time, the rain washing over her, mixing with the silent tears that now streamed down her face. The storm inside her had finally broken free. It was a raging, hopeless tempest, but eventually the pain subsided. It didn't disappear, it settled. A cold, heavy anchor in the hollow where her heart used to be. A permanent emptiness. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself up. Her hands were caked in mud. Her cloak was heavy with water. Her body ached with a soul-deep exhaustion. She stood, and she kept walking. The road was a dark, slick ribbon disappearing into a forest of black ink. The storm raged, but it felt distant now, external. The real storm was the silence inside her, the place where Jaren used to be. She didn't know where she was going. She had no destination, no plan. An Omega, bond broken and alone, was a death sentence in the wilds. But it was better than the slow death of staying there. She walked until her feet were numb and her legs burned. The rain never stopped. The moon, the great liar in the sky, remained hidden behind a thick shroud of angry clouds. She didn't know how many hours had passed. 1, 3, a lifetime. The world was a blur of rain and shadow. Then a new sound cut through the storm. Hoofbeats, heavy, steady, coming up behind her on the muddy road. She froze. Rogues? Hunters? Her heart, the broken thing in her chest, began to hammer against her ribs with a new, sharp fear. She turned, clutching the strap of her satchel. It was a horse, a massive war horse, black as a starless night, its breath pluming in the cold air, and on its back sat a rider, a silhouette of immense power against the stormy dark. He was a creature of shadow and legend, his presence sucking the very air from her lungs. Even from a distance she could feel it. The crushing weight of immense, ancient authority. The rider dismounted in one fluid, silent motion. He didn't rush. He moved like the world had no choice but to wait for him. As he drew closer, the rain seemed to shy away from his broad shoulders. He wore no sigil of any pack she knew. He wore only black leather armor, scarred and worn, and a cloak the color of dried blood. His face was all hard angles and shadows, dominated by a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite and a thick, dark beard. A brutal scar cut from his left temple down across his cheek, disappearing into the scruff. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They glowed, a faint silver luminescence, like twin shards of the moon itself, burning with a cold, terrifying fire. This was no ordinary alpha. This was power made manifest. This was a king. He stopped a few feet from her. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer a cloak. He just looked at her, his glowing eyes raking over her drenched, pathetic form, seeing everything. Seeing the mud, the rain, the raw, gaping wound where her bond used to be. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine needles after a lightning strike, of cold iron and furious restrained power. It was the scent of command, the scent of judgment. He didn't ask why she was alone on a storm-torn road. He didn't ask what she had lost. His voice, when it came, was the deep, resonant growl of stone grinding against stone. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the ground, through her very bones, laced with an ancient, chilling fury. He asked only one thing. "Tell me their names." She stared at him, trembling, unable to process the question. His gaze intensified, pinning her in place. Who broke the ancient laws of the bond? And for the first time that night, the shiver that ran down Talia's spine wasn't from the cold, or the rain, or even the agony of her own shattered heart. It was from the terrifying promise of vengeance that burned in the Alpha King's eyes. The names were poison on her tongue. To speak them would be to admit the truth of it all, to give it form, to give it power. But the king's glowing eyes demanded them. They burned away the rain, the cold, the grief, leaving only his silent, unyielding command. Her own voice was a ghost, a thread of sound nearly lost in the storm. Jaren Elswick, the name of her mate. It felt foreign, a word from a language she no longer spoke. And Isolde Lenthal, the name of her friend. That one cracked her voice, a shard of betrayal lodging itself in her throat. The king did not move, but the air around him grew colder, thicker. A low sound vibrated from his chest, a growl so deep it was more a feeling than a noise. It was the sound of a mountain preparing to crumble. The silver light in his eyes sharpened, the fury within them becoming a physical force. He was a storm contained in the shape of a man. Without another word, he turned back to his horse. He moved with the deadly grace of a predator, every motion economical and precise. He adjusted a strap on his saddle, his large hands sure and steady. He seemed to be ignoring her. For a wild, terrifying moment, she thought he would simply mount his horse and ride away, leaving her to the darkness and the wolves that surely lurked in it. The thought was a new kind of cold, but he didn't. He turned back, his shadow swallowing what little light there was. "You will ride with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact being stated, like the rain falling or the night being dark. She could only stare, her mind a slow, clumsy thing. Where? His scarred lip curled, a motion devoid of any humor. "Away from here." He strode towards her. She flinched, taking an involuntary step back, her foot sinking deeper into the mud. He paid her fear no mind. He reached out and his hand closed around her upper arm. His touch was a shock, not gentle, not cruel, just absolute. His grip was like iron, yet through the worn leather of his gauntlet, she could feel an impossible heat, a furnace of life and power that seemed to push back the bone-deep chill that had claimed her. Her soaked cloak felt suddenly paper-thin. Her entire body trembled at the contact. Her wolf, the broken and whimpering thing inside her, fell silent. It was terrified, and it was captivated. He pulled her forward, her feet stumbling in the thick mud. He led her to the side of the massive warhorse. The beast was a mountain of muscle and shadow, yet it stood perfectly still, utterly subservient to the man beside it. With no warning, he placed his other hand on her waist and lifted. She was weightless. For a heartbeat, she was airborne, a helpless thing in his grasp. Then she was on the saddle, seated in front of him, the wet leather cold beneath her. He swung himself up behind her in one fluid motion, settling into place with a soft creak of leather. She was caged. His body was a wall of heat at her back. His powerful thighs bracketed hers. One of his arms came around her, his hand resting on the pommel of the saddle, effectively locking her in place. The scent of him was overwhelming, pine and lightning and something else, something ancient and metallic, like blood spilled on stone. It filled her lungs, chased away the last lingering ghosts of Jaren's scent, and branded itself onto her memory. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "Hold on," he growled, his voice a low vibration against her spine. Then the world lurched. The horse moved, not with a gentle walk, but with a powerful, ground-eating stride that sent muddy water splashing. The motion forced her back against the king's chest. She could feel the hard plates of his armor through her soaked cloak, the unyielding strength of him. They rode in silence, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. The darkness was complete. She couldn't see the road, couldn't see the trees that lined it. There was only the storm, the motion, and the terrifying living heat pressed against her back. Her mind, which had been a maelstrom of grief and betrayal, was now paralyzed by a new, more immediate reality. She had been found by a legend, Kieran Blackthorn, the Alpha King. Tales of him were whispered by pack elders to frighten unruly pups. A king forged in the crucible of the Northern Wars, who had united the warring clans through sheer brutal force of will. They said he was wolfless, that he'd made a pact with the old gods of winter and shadow. They said he had no heart, and he was angry, not at her, for her. The thought was so foreign, so deeply unsettling, she couldn't wrap her mind around it. No one had ever been angry for her. She was the one who was meant to understand, to forgive, to smooth things over, to be reasonable. The arm in front of her was a corded band of muscle. She could feel the power coiled within it, held in perfect, lethal stillness. What did he want from her? Was this a rescue, or was she merely a piece of evidence? A broken law he intended to display before passing judgment. The pain in her chest, the raw emptiness of the snapped bond, pulsed with a dull, sickening rhythm. It was a constant ache, a phantom limb that would never heal. She instinctively curled into herself, a soft gasp of pain escaping her lips. Behind her, the king went rigid. She felt his breath hitch, a sharp intake of air. The low growl returned, a constant, threatening hum against her back. It wasn't directed at her. It was as if he could feel her pain, and the sensation of it was offensive to him. The horse picked up its pace, its hooves now thundering through the night. He was pushing them onward, as if trying to outrun the echo of her suffering. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The storm began to relent, the furious downpour softening to a steady, grim drizzle. A sliver of pale, wounded moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a world of gray mist and skeletal trees. Ahead, a structure began to resolve out of the mist. It wasn't a pack house. It was a stone lodge, low and brutalist, built like a small fortress. No warm lights shone from the windows. It looked as cold and unforgiving as the king himself. He guided the horse into a stone courtyard, dismounting with that same unnerving silence. For a moment she remained on the saddle, unsure what to do. He looked up at her, his silver eyes catching the faint moonlight. He didn't speak. He simply raised his arms, her breath caught. She had no choice. She slid down from the horse, and he caught her easily. His hands were on her waist, steadying her as her numb legs threatened to buckle. His touch burned through her wet clothes. It was brief, impersonal, and yet it sent a tremor through her entire being. He released her the moment she found her footing. He led the way to a heavy, iron-banded wooden door. It swung open without a sound, revealing a vast, dark chamber. He walked inside, and with a gesture, a fireplace on the far wall roared to life, flames leaping up as if answering a silent command. The room was Spartan, stone walls, a floor covered in dark furs, a heavy wooden table, and 2 chairs. It was a warrior's refuge. a place of function, not comfort. "Sit," he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. He gestured to one of the chairs by the fire. She obeyed, her limbs stiff and clumsy. She sank into the chair, the furs draped over it soft against her aching body. The heat from the fire was a blessing, a slow creeping warmth that began to fight back the chill in her bones, though it couldn't touch the ice in her soul. He disappeared into the shadows for a moment, returning with a metal flask and a rough-spun blanket. He tossed the blanket onto her lap. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke and him. Then he unstoppered the flask and held it out. "Drink." She took it, her fingers brushing his. Another jolt, like lightning. She raised the flask to her lips, the scar there tingling. A strong, burning liquid slid down her throat. It wasn't wine, it was something harsher, medicinal, but it sent a wave of heat through her chest. He stood before the fire, his back to her, a monolith of silent fury. The firelight danced on his dark armor, painting him in shades of blood and gold. "They are from the Silver Creek pack," he stated, not a question. She nodded, clutching the flask. "Yes. The Alpha is a weak fool. He lets his people flout the old laws." He turned his head slightly, his glowing eyes pinning her from across the room. "The bond is sacred, a promise made not just to another wolf, but to the moon herself. To break it willingly is to spit in the goddess's eye. It unbalances everything." His voice was low, laced with a contempt so profound it was chilling. "They told me," Talia whispered, her voice raw. "They said the moon corrected its choice." He turned fully to face her then, and the look on his face was terrible. It was a mask of cold, controlled rage. "The moon does not make mistakes." He took a step closer, then another. He stopped before her chair, looming over her. He was so tall, so broad. He blocked out the light from the fire. She was trapped in his shadow. He slowly knelt, bringing his terrifying gaze level with hers. Up close, she could see the silver in his eyes wasn't just a glow. It was alive, swirling, like a captive storm. "The mark," he said, his voice a guttural whisper. "Let me see it." Instinctively, her hand went to her collarbone, where the faint silvery lines of her mating mark had once glowed with warmth and life. Now it was just a cold spot on her skin, a place of death. Shaking, she pulled aside the damp collar of her tunic. There, on her skin, was a faint, bruised-looking shadow, a ghostly echo of the intricate pattern it once was, now faded and gray, like an old scar. The king's eyes fixed on it. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He reached out, his fingers tracing the air just above her skin, not quite touching her. She could feel the heat radiating from his hand, the sheer power thrumming beneath his skin. "It is not gone," he murmured, his voice tight with some unreadable emotion. "It is dormant, tainted." His gaze lifted, meeting hers. The fury was still there, but beneath it was something else, something ancient. A pain that mirrored her own, but 1,000 times older, 1,000 times colder. "They did not simply break a promise to you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, dangerous whisper that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "They woke something up in me." His words hung in the air, heavy and strange. "They woke something up in me." He was still kneeling before her, his proximity a crushing weight. The heat of him was a physical presence, a furnace that warred with the chill of her grief. His silver eyes were fixed on her face, searching, demanding, seeing far too much. She could feel his breath, a ghost of warmth against the cold, damp skin of her neck. She should have been terrified. And she was. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A strange, unnerving stillness. The frantic, broken creature inside her, her wolf, her soul, had stopped its panicked thrashing. It was watching him, listening. As if it recognized the sound of the deep, ancient anger in his voice, he finally pulled back, rising to his full, intimidating height. The spell was broken, the air rushed back into her lungs. "The law is not a set of rules written in a book, Omega," he said, his back to her once more as he stared into the roaring fire. The flames cast his shadow long and monstrous against the stone wall. "It is a living thing, a balance. When a bond, a true bond, is forged, it draws power from the moon, from the earth. It adds to the balance. When it is broken, unlawfully, it creates a void, a debt. He spoke of magic as if it were an old, familiar enemy. A debt must be paid, he finished, his voice dropping low, each word a chip of ice. Talia clutched the heavy blanket around her shoulders, the rough wool a small comfort. Her mind struggled to keep up. Jaren and Isolde hadn't just betrayed her. They had broken something fundamental, something this king, this force of nature, seemed to hold sacred. "What will you do?" she whispered, the question tasting of fear. He turned his head, his profile sharp and brutal in the firelight. "I will restore the balance." There was no hint of mercy in his tone, only the grim finality of a glacier carving its way through a mountain. He was not talking about reconciliation or negotiation. He was talking about retribution. A part of her, the part that still remembered Jaren's laugh and Isolde's smile, recoiled in horror. But another part, the newly hollowed-out part, felt a dark, shameful flicker of satisfaction. The king moved away from the fire and gestured to a dark wooden door she hadn't noticed before. "There are dry clothes in there, a bed. You will rest." She looked at the door, then back at him. Rest felt impossible. Sleep felt like a distant country she'd never see again. "I don't—" she started, but the words died. What could she say? "I don't know who you are. I don't know why you're helping me. I don't know if I'm your guest or your prisoner." He heard the questions she didn't ask. "You are under my protection now," he said, and the words were an oath forged in iron. "No one will harm you here." He walked to the main door of the lodge, his footsteps unnervingly silent for such a large man. He pulled it open, and a gust of cold, rain-scented air swept into the room, making the fire gutter wildly. He stepped out into the night, closing the heavy door behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing silence. She didn't move for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire and the frantic beat of her own heart. Finally, the cold began to seep back into her bones. Shivering, she rose on unsteady legs and walked to the door he had indicated. It opened into a small, simple room. A bed, covered in dark furs. A wooden chest at its foot. A wash basin with a pitcher of clean water. It was as Spartan as the main hall, but it was clean, and it was quiet. On top of the chest was a folded tunic of dark gray linen and a pair of soft leather breeches. They were men's clothes, his probably. She stripped off her wet, muddy things, leaving them in a miserable heap on the stone floor. Her body was a map of bruises from her fall, but the real damage was invisible. The cold spot on her collarbone where her mark had been seemed to ache with a profound emptiness. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the memory of Jaren's and Isolde's pitying expressions. It didn't work. She pulled on the tunic. It was far too large, hanging almost to her knees, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but it was dry and warm, and it smelled of him. Pine, wood smoke, and that strange, sharp scent of ozone after a storm. The scent was grounding. It was a solid, undeniable thing in a world that had dissolved into smoke. She pushed the sleeves up and crept back out into the main hall. He was there. The door was closed again, the storm shut out. He had taken off his gauntlets and armor, leaving him in a simple black undershirt that strained across his broad chest and shoulders. The scars on his arms were a tangled web of silver lines in the firelight. He had set a bowl of steaming stew and a hunk of dark bread on the small table near the fire. He was eating his own, his movements efficient and focused. He looked up as she approached, his silver eyes tracking her. "Eat," he commanded, his voice softer now, but no less authoritative. She sat opposite him, the wooden chair feeling immense. She was swimming in his clothes, a lost thing in his fortress, eating his food. The stew was thick with meat and root vegetables, and it sent a wave of life-giving warmth through her. She ate slowly at first, then with a hunger that surprised her. She hadn't realized how empty she was, in every sense of the word. They ate in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. It was watchful. He ate like he did everything else, with a lethal economy of motion, but he watched her. She could feel his gaze on her, even when she kept her eyes fixed on her bowl. When she was finished, he took her empty bowl and set it aside. He didn't press her with more questions. He simply returned to his place by the fire, a silent, brooding guardian. Drawn by the heat, Talia curled up in the chair she'd sat in earlier, pulling the heavy wool blanket tightly around herself. The immediate threat of the storm and the road was gone, replaced by the strange, tense safety of this lodge. And with that safety, the pain began to creep back in. It was a physical ache now. The hollow in her chest felt raw, scraped out. Her inner wolf was silent, but it was a wounded silence. She unconsciously raised a hand to her collarbone, her fingers tracing the place where the bond mark had been. She remembered Jaren tracing it with his thumb, whispering that it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. A tear, hot and traitorous, escaped her eye and slid down her cheek. She brushed it away angrily. And then it happened. A faint, tingling warmth spread across her skin, right beneath her fingertips. It was impossibly faint. A ghost of a sensation, but it was there. She froze, her hand still pressed to her collarbone. The warmth pulsed, just once, like a faltering heartbeat. She snatched her hand away as if she'd been burned. Across the room, the king went perfectly still. His head snapped in her direction. His silver eyes were no longer just glowing. They were blazing. He had been watching the fire, but he knew. Somehow, he knew. In 2 long, silent strides, he was in front of her chair, his presence obliterating everything else. He didn't kneel this time. He loomed, his expression one of fierce, incredulous intensity. "Again," he commanded, his voice a raw whisper. "Touch it again." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was too afraid to obey, too afraid to refuse. Her hand trembled as she slowly, hesitantly, lifted it back to her collarbone. The moment her fingers brushed her skin, it happened again. A pulse. But this time, it was stronger. A soft, silvery light flickered beneath her skin, for just a fraction of a second. A single luminous echo in the graveyard of her bond. A choked sound escaped the king's throat. It was a sound of disbelief, of agony, of a terrible, dawning hope. He reached out, not to her, but to the empty air beside her neck, his fingers spread wide as if trying to catch smoke. He was close, so close. The heat coming off him was immense. "The echo," he breathed, his eyes wide, locked on the spot where the light had faded. "It's answering." Talia stared up at him, her own shock forgotten in the face of his raw, unguarded reaction. The mask of the implacable king had shattered, and in its place was a man staring at a miracle. Or a ghost. "Answering?" she whispered. "Answering what?" He looked at her then, and his eyes were twin storms of silver fire. The rage was gone, replaced by an emotion so ancient and powerful it stole the breath from her lungs. It was a hunger, a grief, a longing that seemed carved into the very essence of his soul. He didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. Somehow, in the deepest, most broken part of her, she already knew. The faint warmth beneath her skin wasn't coming from her. It was answering him. The air in the room became thin, charged with a tension that felt older than the stones of the lodge. The fire crackled, oblivious. Her own heartbeat was a frantic drum against the sudden, profound silence that stretched between them. He was staring at the space on her collarbone, as if he could see the echo of that impossible light, taste the ghost of its power. The raw hunger in his eyes was terrifying. It wasn't the look of an alpha for a female. It was the look of a starving man seeing a single drop of water in an endless desert. "How?" The word was torn from him, a guttural sound of disbelief. She had no answer. She was the vessel for this strangeness, not its master. She felt like a string on a harp that had just been plucked by an unseen hand. The vibration was fading, leaving only a tingling, unnerving memory on her skin. He took a step back, a deliberate, controlled motion, as if putting a necessary distance between them. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture rough, agitated. He began to pace before the hearth, a caged wolf, the immense calm he had shown earlier completely shattered. "It is not possible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "The bond is severed. An echo should not answer a call that was not made. Talia watched him, her fear slowly giving way to a dawning, terrifying comprehension. A call that was not made, but she had felt it. A pulse from him, a whisper of power so subtle she hadn't even recognized it. And the broken thing inside her had responded. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was you. It answered you." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. The firelight caught the brutal scar on his face, making it seem to deepen. His expression was grim, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. "My bloodline is old," he said, the word seeming to cost him something. "It carries a curse, a hunger, an emptiness that no true mate bond has ever been able to fill. For generations, my ancestors have been born with a flaw, a piece missing from our souls." He gestured vaguely to his own chest. "The space where the bond is meant to anchor is a void. It pulls, it aches, it is a constant, unending cold." Her own new, raw emptiness felt like a child's scraped knee compared to the ancient, generational abyss he was describing. She thought of the whispers she'd heard. Wolfless, heartless, cursed. They weren't just stories, they were his truth. "When a bond is unlawfully broken," he continued, his voice dropping, "it leaves behind a wound on the world, a scar in the balance of things. My blood feels that wound. It calls to it, always." He looked at her, and the distance between them felt charged with a dangerous, invisible current. "But no one," he said, his voice laced with a terrible wonder, "has ever called back." She was an anomaly, a freak of spiritual physics. Her bond with Jaren had been broken so violently, so completely, that it had left behind something more than a scar. It had left a ghost, a phantom limb that could still feel, still twitch, still respond to the gravitational pull of the king's own profound emptiness. The revelation was devastating. It meant the love she'd felt for Jaren, the bond she'd cherished, was so strong that its death had created a spiritual aberration. It was a testament to her loyalty, and a monument to her pain. A new wave of grief, sharp and crystalline, washed over her. She wrapped her arms around herself, the big tunic a poor shield against the sudden chill. The king saw the shift in her, the fresh wave of pain. His jaw tightened. The wonder in his eyes was replaced by that familiar cold fury. "He did not deserve what you gave him," he stated. The words a judgment passed down from a throne of ice and stone. To be given a gift of such magnitude, and to cast it aside for convenience, for ambition. He practically spat the words. "It is the highest form of blasphemy." He fell silent then, staring into the flames again, lost in a darkness she couldn't begin to fathom. The night deepened outside, the fire burned lower. Exhaustion, heavy and absolute, began to weigh down her limbs. The emotional whiplash of the last several hours had left her hollowed out, scoured clean. She must have drifted off, her head lolling against the back of the chair. She was lost in a gray, formless sea of half-dreams, the pain in her chest a distant, throbbing anchor. A sound startled her awake, a soft scrape of leather. She opened her eyes. The fire was little more than a bed of glowing orange embers, casting the room in deep shadows. The king was standing over her. He had a thick fur pelt in his arms. He moved with a quietness that was unnerving, a predator in the dark. She tensed, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't speak. He simply unfolded the heavy fur. It looked like black bear, thick and impossibly soft, and draped it over her on top of the wool blanket. The weight of it was immense, comforting. It smelled of the cold night air, of pine, and of him. His fingers brushed the side of her neck as he adjusted the pelt. Her skin erupted in goosebumps. Her pulse stumbled. The echo on her collarbone pulsed, a soft, warm, definite thrum of light beneath her skin. This time, it wasn't a surprise. It felt responsive, like a sigh. His breath hitched. He froze, his hand still hovering near her shoulder. She could feel his gaze on her in the darkness, intense and searing. She didn't dare breathe. She could feel the heat of his body, the sheer coiled power of him held in absolute stillness. For a long stretched heartbeat, she thought he might touch her again, that he might press his fingers to the mark, chasing that ghostly warmth. The air was so thick with unspoken things, it was hard to draw a breath. Then, with a low, controlled exhale, he pulled his hand back. He straightened up, a tall, dark shape against the dying embers. "Sleep, Omega," he whispered. And his voice was rough, strained. "You are safe here." He turned and walked to the other side of the hearth, where he settled into the other chair, not to sleep, but to watch. He sat there, unmoving, a guardian carved from shadow and fury, his silver eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. She knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that he would not sleep. He would watch over her until dawn. And under the weight of his protection, under the heavy, warm furs that carried his scent, Talia closed her eyes. For the first time since her world had shattered, she didn't feel alone in her pain. She slept, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't dream of Jaren. She dreamt of silver eyes and a cold, silent promise. She woke to the smell of snow. The fire was roaring again. Early morning light, pale and gray, filtered through a high window. She was still in the chair, warm and cocooned in the furs. The king was gone. Panic, sharp and immediate, seized her. She sat up, the furs pooling in her lap. The lodge was empty, silent. Had he left? Had it all been a strange, grief-induced hallucination? Then she saw it. On the heavy table, where their bowls had been the night before, sat a steaming mug, a small loaf of bread, and a glistening red apple. Her panic subsided, replaced by a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. She stood and walked to the door, pushing the heavy wood open a crack. A blast of frigid air hit her. The world outside had been transformed. A thick blanket of fresh white snow covered everything, muffling the world in a profound silence. The sky was a uniform, heavy gray, and in the middle of the courtyard, stripped to the waist despite the biting cold, was the king. Snow was falling lightly, melting on his skin. Steam rose from his broad, heavily scarred back as he moved. He held a massive, double-bladed axe in his hands, and he was swinging it with a brutal, rhythmic grace, splitting huge rounds of wood with single, devastating blows. Thunk, crack, thunk, crack. Each swing was a release of power, a controlled explosion of muscle and intent. It wasn't just a chore, it was a ritual, a meditation, a way to burn off the rage that seemed to perpetually simmer just beneath his skin. She watched him, mesmerized. His body was a tapestry of old wars. Scars, thick and pale, crisscrossed the tanned skin of his back and arms. He was a living history of violence. And yet, there was an undeniable beauty in his strength, in the perfect, lethal focus of his movements. As if sensing her gaze, he stopped. The axe came to rest, its head buried in the splitting block. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood there, breathing deeply, his breath pluming in the icy air. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at her. His silver eyes met hers across the snowy courtyard. There was no artifice between them. No ranks, just a man and a woman surrounded by a cold, silent world. In that look, an unspoken oath was passed. He would not abandon her. And she was no longer just a victim of a broken promise. She was the witness to his. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, dictated by the snow and the king's brooding silence. He never asked her about Jaren or Isolde again. He never pressed her for details of her broken life. He simply existed, a powerful, grounding presence at the edge of her awareness. He would spend his mornings training in the courtyard, his movements a blur of deadly force, the sound of his axe or the whistle of a sword cutting through the cold air. Afternoons were spent in the lodge, sharpening weapons, mending leather armor, or simply staring into the fire, lost in thoughts she couldn't begin to guess. He never touched her again, not even by accident. He moved around her with a careful, deliberate grace, as if she were a wild, spooked animal he was afraid of frightening away. Or perhaps, she thought with a shiver, as if she were a flame he was afraid of getting too close to. The echo on her collarbone remained dormant, a sleeping ghost, but she was always aware of it now, a faint tingling potential just beneath her skin. And she was aware of him, of the constant, low-level thrum of his power, the deep, resonant hum of his ancient bloodline. It was like living next to a sleeping volcano. She, in turn, found purpose in small things, She swept the stone floors. She kept the fire fed. She learned to make a passable stew from the rations in his storeroom. They were simple, mindless tasks that kept her hands busy and her grief at bay. They were the actions of a survivor, not a victim. One afternoon, while he was cleaning his formidable collection of knives by the fire, she found the courage to speak. "My wolf," she said, her voice small in the vast, quiet room. "She's silent." Kieran didn't look up from the whetstone, but the steady, rhythmic scrape of steel on stone paused. "She is wounded. The severing of a bond is a near-mortal blow to the spirit. Will she ever come back?" The question was a raw, vulnerable thing. To be wolfless was to be incomplete, a shifter without their other half. He finally lifted his gaze, and his silver eyes were unexpectedly soft, though no less intense. "She is not gone. She is listening, waiting. When your own heart is ready to heal, she will answer." His words were a comfort, but also a challenge. When your heart is ready to heal, was it? The wound felt as raw as it had that first night. The betrayal was a poison that still worked its way through her veins. Later that day, driven by a need for air, she bundled herself in one of his heavy cloaks and stepped out into the snow-covered forest that surrounded the lodge. The world was hushed, beautiful, and cold. The snow crunched under her boots. Each breath was a sharp, clean sting in her lungs. She walked without a destination, following a half-frozen stream, the sound of the gurgling water a quiet companion. For the first time in days, she let herself think of them. Jaren? Isolde. She didn't try to summon the anger. She didn't dwell on the pain. She just remembered. She remembered Jaren teaching her to skip stones across this very kind of stream. She remembered weaving crowns of wildflowers with Isolde in a summer meadow, their laughter echoing in the warm air. They were ghosts, memories of people who no longer existed. The Harn and Isolde who had stood before her in that room were strangers, cold, resolute. Their love for each other had burned away everything she had once known. A single tear traced a path down her cold cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief this time. It was a tear of farewell. A twig snapped behind her. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. It wasn't Kieran. 3 wolves emerged from the trees, their movements low and predatory. They weren't ordinary forest wolves. They were too large, their eyes too intelligent, their lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs. Rogues, scavengers, killers. Their scent hit her a second later, rancid, unwashed, thick with malice. Her blood ran cold. She was an Omega, alone. Her own wolf a silent, broken thing. She had no weapon, no defense. The leader, a huge brute with a matted gray coat and a scarred muzzle, took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. They had smelled her weakness, her lack of a pack scent, her solitary despair. She was easy prey. She backed away slowly, her boots slipping on the icy stones by the stream. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird. This was it. This was how she would die. A pathetic, lonely end in a frozen wood. The gray wolf lunged. She screamed, throwing her arms up to shield her face. A blur of black motion exploded from the trees to her right. It wasn't a wolf, it was a man. Kieran. He moved with an impossible, inhuman speed. He met the rogue in midair, a flash of steel in his hand. There was a sickening, wet crunch, and the gray wolf fell to the snow, its lunge cut short, its life extinguished. A dark dagger was buried to the hilt in its neck. The other 2 rogues hesitated, their snarling turning to whines of confusion and fear. They had not scented him. He moved like a shadow, his presence masked until the moment he chose to strike. Kieran didn't give them time to regroup. He rose from his crouch, pulling a second blade from his belt. He was no longer the quiet, brooding man from the lodge. He was a whirlwind of death. His silver eyes blazed with a light that was utterly inhuman, a cold, merciless fire. He flowed toward the remaining 2 wolves. It wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter, a dance of brutal efficiency. A parry, a spin, a lethal thrust. In seconds, it was over. The 2 rogues lay dead in the snow, their blood a shocking, vivid red against the white. Silence descended. Heavy, absolute. Kieran stood over, the last wolf he'd killed, his chest rising and falling heavily. His blades dripped crimson. Snowflakes melted on his bare, heated skin. He wore only his breeches and boots. The cold didn't touch him. He turned to her. His face was a mask of terrifying fury, but it wasn't the cold, controlled anger she had seen before. This was a hot, wild rage, a primal, possessive fire. His eyes weren't just glowing, they were burning. "Did they touch you?" he growled, the words scraping from his throat. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. She was trembling from head to toe, a combination of lingering terror and the shocking, violent spectacle she had just witnessed. He stalked toward her, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He grabbed her arms, his grip hard, almost painful. He scanned her from head to toe, his blazing eyes searching for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a raw command. "No," she finally managed to whisper. "No, I'm not hurt. You saved me." The words seemed to break through his rage. The fire in his eyes receded slightly, replaced by a dark, swirling storm of emotion. He looked at her pale face, her wide, frightened eyes, the single tear track still frozen on her cheek. And then he did something that shattered the careful distance he had maintained for days. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapped around her, crushing her to his hard, warm chest. One hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. The other splayed across her back, holding her as if he intended to meld her body to his. His head descended. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a brand. It was fury and relief and a desperate, possessive claim. It tasted of the cold winter air, of blood, and of a loneliness so profound it stole her breath. There was no tenderness in it, only a raw, overwhelming need. He was pouring all his rage, all his fear for her, all the cursed hunger of his bloodline into that single, devastating act. Her mind went white. The world dissolved into the shocking, undeniable reality of his lips on hers, and on her collarbone, the echo ignited. It wasn't a flicker this time, it was a supernova. A blazing, white-hot sun of silver light exploded beneath her skin, so bright it was visible even in the winter daylight. A wave of pure, unadulterated power surged through her, a current arcing from his soul, through their joined lips, and directly into the hollow where her bond had once been. The pain in her chest vanished. It was replaced by a fire, a roaring, impossible inferno of feeling. It was his emptiness, his hunger, his power flooding her. And in return, the ghost of her bond, the powerful, loyal echo of her love, surged back into him. He groaned against her mouth, a deep, agonized sound. His kiss softened, deepened, became something else entirely. The raw fury bled away, replaced by a desperate, soul-shattering tenderness. He was drinking from her and she from him, 2 broken, hollowed-out souls finding a terrifying, temporary wholeness in each other's arms. Her inner wolf, silent for so long, awoke with a ferocious, joyful howl. "Mate!" it screamed, a word she never thought she'd feel again. Ours! But he wasn't her mate. He couldn't be. This was something else. Something dangerous and forbidden and utterly, terrifyingly real. As suddenly as it began, he broke the kiss. He tore himself away from her, stumbling back as if he'd been burned. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his silver eyes wide with shock and self-loathing. His lips were dark, swollen. He looked from her mouth to the spot on her collarbone, where the silver light was slowly, reluctantly, fading back to a faint, pulsing glow. "What have I done?" he whispered, and the sound was filled with a despair so profound it chilled her to the bone. He turned and fled, crashing back through the forest toward the lodge, leaving her alone with the dead wolves, the falling snow, and the ghost of his kiss burning on her lips like a stolen star. She stumbled back to the lodge in a daze. The world felt unreal, tilted on its axis. The snow-covered trees, the dead wolves, the blood staining the pristine white. It all seemed like a dream. The only thing that felt real was the searing brand of his kiss on her lips and the wild, thrumming hum beneath her skin, where the echo had awakened. Her wolf was awake, truly awake. It paced the confines of her soul, no longer a wounded, whimpering thing, but a creature reborn in fire and shadow. It tasted the king's power on her tongue, recognized the scent of him now woven into the very fabric of her being, and it wanted more. It howled its triumphant, possessive joy, a feeling so potent it made her dizzy. When she pushed open the heavy door to the lodge, the scene inside stopped her cold. Kieran was there, but he was not the man who had fled from her in the woods. He stood in the center of the room, fully dressed in his black leather armor, his cloak clasped at his shoulders. His formidable axe was strapped to his back. His warhorse, saddled and ready, stood waiting in the open doorway to the courtyard, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He was leaving. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The nascent joy in her chest turned to ice. His face was a mask of stone, colder and harder than she had ever seen it. The scar on his cheek was a pale, stark line against his grimly set jaw. He wouldn't look at her. His silver eyes were fixed on some point beyond the far wall, a place of duty and grim resolve. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all the emotion that had poured from him in the forest. It was the voice of the Alpha King, pronouncing a sentence. What? The word was a choked whisper. "This place is no longer safe for you. Those rogues were drawn by the scent of your broken bond. More will come. And He paused, his jaw tightening. "I am not safe for you." The admission was a shard of glass. He finally looked at her then, and his eyes were filled with a bleak, agonizing self-recrimination. What happened in the forest was a failing, a weakness. My curse responded to your echo, and I lost control. I took something that was not mine to take. "You saved my life," she said, taking a step toward him. "And I put it in danger in the same breath," he snarled, the sound a whip crack of fury directed entirely at himself. "That light, that power, it is a beacon. It calls to things that hunger, things like me, and things far worse." He turned away, striding toward his horse. "I am taking you to the Sunstone Citadel. It is the seat of the Western River Pax. You will be given sanctuary there. You will be protected. Protected." He spoke the word as if it were a cage. She would be handed off, a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be shed. He was pushing her away, putting a continent between them to ensure he never lost control again. The kiss that had felt like a cataclysm, like the beginning of a new world, had been nothing more than a mistake to him. A momentary lapse he was already working to correct. The hollow in her chest, so recently filled with a terrifying, brilliant fire, began to ache with a new, colder kind of emptiness. This was worse than Jaren's betrayal. Jaren had discarded her because he saw her as weak, as a mistake. Kieran was casting her aside because he saw her as a temptation he was too weak to resist. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it stopped him in his tracks. He froze, his hand on his horse's reins. Slowly he turned back to face her. "What did you say?" She lifted her chin, the terror and grief of the past few days crystallizing into something hard and sharp within her. She had been a victim, a refugee, a quiet, broken thing. She had been passed from one man's betrayal to another man's protection. No one had asked her what she wanted. "I said no," she repeated, her voice stronger now, imbued with the newfound fire of her reawakened wolf. "I will not be sent away. I will not be hidden like a shameful secret." A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "You do not understand. You are an Omega. You cannot— I am not just an Omega." The words tore from her, a raw, ragged cry of defiance. "I am the other half of this thing between us. You said it yourself. My echo answered your call. It is a part of me. You do not get to decide what to do with it, or with me, as if I am just some prize to be locked in a tower." She strode toward him, her fear burned away by a righteous, desperate anger. She stopped just before him, forcing him to look down at her. "You talk about balance," she accused, her voice trembling with the force of her emotion. "You say a debt must be paid. What about the debt to me, to the life that was stolen from me? Jaren and Isolde are still out there, living the life they built on my broken heart. And you want to hide me away while you go and— what? Avenge a law?" His face was granite. "Their punishment is my burden, not yours." Everything that has happened is my burden, she cried. You don't get to carry it for me. Not anymore. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, demanding to be seen. Not as a weakness, not as a temptation, but as an equal in this strange, violent fate that had bound them together. What happened in the forest, it wasn't a mistake, she whispered. The words a raw confession. It was the first true thing I have felt since my bond was broken. It was life. It was a promise. His composure finally cracked. A flicker of raw, agonizing longing broke through the stone. He looked at her as if she were the sun, and he had been living in darkness his entire life. I cannot give you promises, he ground out, his voice thick with pain. I can only give you danger. I am a king with 1,000 enemies, and a curse that turns tenderness into a weapon. To stand by my side is a death sentence. To live without a soul is also a death sentence, she shot back. And I have been living it for days. I was dying on that road when you found me, and in the woods today, when your lips touched mine. I finally started to live again. She took a final trembling step, closing the last inch of space between them. She reached up, her hand hesitant, and laid her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. The leather of his armor was cold, but beneath it she could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his life. Don't send me away, Kieran, she whispered, using his name for the first time. It felt both intimate and dangerous on her tongue. Let me choose. Let me stand with you. Let me be the storm that helps you restore the balance. He stared down at her, his silver eyes a swirling vortex of conflict. Every instinct, every lifetime of discipline and control was screaming at him to push her away, to put her on the horse and send her to safety, to protect her from himself. But her touch was an anchor, her fierce, defiant spirit was a beacon. The echo of her bond was singing a siren song to the hollow in his soul. He closed his eyes, his entire body trembling with the force of his internal war. A long, ragged breath escaped his lips. When he opened his eyes again, the conflict was gone. In its place was a grim, terrifying resolve. He had made a choice. He reached up and his hand covered hers, his fingers lacing with hers, pressing her palm harder against his chest. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was a brand, an acceptance. They broke the law, he said, his voice a low, resonant vow that vibrated through her hand, into her very bones. They took your life. They woke my curse. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His silver eyes bored into hers, sealing the oath between them. Then let the balance be paid, he whispered, and the words were not a king's decree, but a shared promise. And let the storm that comes for them be us. A year had passed. The snow had long since melted, and the world was alive with the scent of summer roses and warm, damp earth. Talia stood on a stone balcony overlooking a sprawling valley, a gentle breeze stirring the wisps of hair that had escaped her braid. This was the heart of the Blackthorn Kingdom, a fortress carved into the side of a mountain, but it was not a place of cold stone and shadows. Under her touch, gardens bloomed in defiance of the high altitude, and life had begun to seep back into the ancient, lonely halls. It was her home now. She heard his footsteps behind her, the familiar, quiet tread that could no longer startle her. His presence was a warmth at her back, a comforting weight that settled the last of the restless ghosts inside her. Kieran came to stand beside her, his powerful form eclipsing the late afternoon sun. He didn't speak, simply rested his hand on the small of her back. It was a familiar gesture now, an anchor. His touch was no longer a prelude to a storm, but a promise of stillness. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The black leather he always wore was warm from the sun. His scent, pine and winter air, was the scent of safety, of belonging. You're thinking of them, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy peaks. Not of the pain, just the memory of the day we went back. They had ridden to the Silver Creek Pack not as a storm of fire and vengeance, but as the quiet, inexorable hand of the law. Kieran had not drawn a blade. He had not needed to. He had simply stood before the pack, the full crushing weight of his authority as Alpha King radiating from him, and he had passed judgment. He had not killed Jaren and Isolde. Death would have been a mercy. Instead, he had invoked the oldest law of all, the law of balance. Standing before their pack, he had placed his hand over Talia's collarbone. The echo, no, not an echo anymore, but a living silver light, had blazed to life at his touch, a star born in the daylight. A new kind of mark, forged not by fate, but by choice, a bond created from two broken souls. The sight of it, of this impossible magic, had shattered Jaren and Isolde's stolen bond on the spot. Talia had felt it sever, a distant, hollow pop. She had watched as the light faded from their eyes, as the faded connection they had built on her ruin crumbled to ash. They were left with nothing, two empty vessels, haunted by the ghost of a power they had stolen and lost. They were bond-broken, stripped of their future, their status, their very souls, left to live out their days in the shell of the life they had coveted. It was a far more fitting punishment than a clean death. It was the justice of a mirror. "Do you ever regret it?" Kieran's voice was a low rumble against her ear. "That I did not give you a blood price?" Talia turned, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. The rough stubble scratched gently against her palm. She traced the brutal scar on his cheek, a line she had come to love as much as any other part of him. He no longer flinched from her touch. He leaned into it, his silver eyes closing for a brief moment of peace. "No," she whispered, her voice certain. "You gave me balance. You gave us a beginning. That was worth more than revenge." His eyes opened, and the light in them was just for her. The lonely, cursed king was gone. In his place was her Kieran, her mate, not by the moon's decree, but by a vow whispered in the dark, sealed with a desperate kiss in a blood-stained snowfield. Their bond was a strange, beautiful thing. It had its own language, its own rhythm. It was a quiet thrum of power that flowed between them, a constant awareness of the other's soul. The emptiness in him had not been vanquished, but filled. Her light now resided in his hollow spaces, and his strength now buttressed her healing heart. They had made each other whole. He captured her hand, turning his head to press a kiss into the center of her palm. The simple act sent a wave of warmth through her, a familiar, joyful pulse that made the silver mark on her collarbone tingle with life. "The council from the west arrives tomorrow," he murmured, his lips moving against her skin. "They still don't know what to make of you," Talia smiled. "Let them wonder. They are used to queens who are born to power. I am a queen who had to walk out of her own grave to find it." Pride, fierce and bright, burned in his eyes. He saw her not as the broken Omega he had found on the road, but as the defiant woman who had refused to be sent away, who had claimed her own power and forced him to reckon with his own heart. He drew her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her effortlessly until her feet left the ground. She laughed, a sound that was still new and precious to them both, wrapping her arms around his neck. "My fierce Omega," he growled, the sound playful now, stripped of its old menace. "My heartless king," she countered, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. He set her down gently, his gaze full of a love so profound it still sometimes stole her breath. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. They stood like that for a long time as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Later that night, they stood on the same balcony, bathed in the light of a full, brilliant moon. The air was cool now, scented with night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below. Kieran's hand rested over her mark, his thumb stroking the smooth skin. A soft, steady silver light pulsed from beneath her skin, a gentle, contented heartbeat that matched the rhythm of her own. "The night we met," she said softly, her gaze on the celestial body that had once been her goddess and her betrayer, "I thought the moon had lied." He turned her to face him, his silver eyes drinking in the sight of her. The moonlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun silver. He looked at the faint scar on her lip, a testament to a life before him, and he lowered his head, pressing the softest of kisses to it. "She didn't lie, Talia," he whispered against her skin. She was simply waiting for a better story to tell. His lips found hers then, not with the memory of fury and desperation, but with the quiet, certain promise of 1,000 shared sunrises, a kiss of homecoming, of peace, of a love forged in defiance of fate itself. The moon had seen their scars long enough. Tonight she watched them heal,